Ahora va a subir al escenario Karl Berglund, que viene desde el norte de Suecia, de Uppsala, que allí sí que hace frío. Come stage. Y ha escrito un libro que se llama Reading Audio Readers, publicado por Bloomsbury Press en pasado mes de enero, que os recomiendo a todos los profesionales del sector audio. Aunque va a hablar de audiolibros, a todas las personas profesionales de los podcasts, estar muy atentos, porque vais a dar con muchas claves sobre patrones de escucha y comportamientos de escucha, específicamente de audiolibros, pero que son muy aplicables. Veréis que ha hecho una segmentación de diferentes patrones. Leyendo su libro hubo una que se lo he comentado que me sentí muy identificado, que solo os doy el titular, son los repetidores, gente que escucha continuamente el mismo contenido. Muchísimas gracias por venir desde Suecia y os recomiendo que una vez que le habéis escuchado, leáis el libro porque verdaderamente, como digo, os va a dar muchas claves. Thank you, Karl. All yours.
Thank you, Javier. Really nice to be here. All right. As you all know, then, there is a global and ongoing boom in audiobooks. But this is, in particular true for the Nordic countries. And in Sweden, which is what I study empirically, audiobooks have been more or less exploding. In 2022, in Sweden, roughly 24 million print books were sold. In the same year, around 45 million audiobooks were streamed through. So you can sort of think about these numbers in a way. To stream an audiobook is the most common way to take part of literature today in Sweden. In terms of revenues, however, the picture is a bit different. It's roughly around a third of the market share. And the Nordic countries, they might be understood then as book cultures of early adapters. But the most important thing for these figures, of course, is that we have the subscription model for these streaming services, and they have really great selections of most of the books in the markets. So perhaps you can look at the Nordics in a way to see, but this might be what will come in the rest of the world in terms of audiobooks. And the rise of streamed audiobooks, it deeply affects our book and reading culture in a multitude of ways. The new reading medium, the audiobook, then, will generate new reading practices, and this new business model, the subscription, when you pay a monthly fee for access to a vast catalog of titles where you can listen more or less as much as you want, then this will generate new consumption practices. What's also interesting to me is that this enables new ways also to study readers and reading, because these book streaming services, they collect large amounts of user data. So for my research, I have been given access to small, but still parts of this data from Storytel, the by far largest book streaming service in Sweden, and also a global company present in some 25 countries, I think, including Spain and lots of other Spanish-speaking countries as well. And this user data that I have received is for a large selection of commercially successful books for all Swedish users on the level per user and hour during 1 year. And this is basically what the data looks like. So this is my favorite slide. It's basically, you can think about it, I will explain this a bit, but you can think about it as one giant matrix Excel file, more or less, with a couple of columns and millions of rows, right? So here we have the pseudo ID. That's a pseudonymized code for one particular user. The ISBN, of course, is the title in question. The hour is the hour when the streaming session ended. And then we have the consumption minutes, is the number of minutes that the session lasted. So if we look at just one row here as an example, what we can tell from this data is that this particular user streamed this particular book during roughly 1.5 hours in a session that ended somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning during June 8, 2020. So as you can say, I mean, it's you can get a very, very detailed look and picture on what people are actually doing with books. And this is something completely new to research and to the book industry, I'd say. And again, high granularity, but also a really large scale. This is what I have looked at in this book. And this is what it looks like. It's called Reading Audio Readers, Book Consumption in the Streaming Age. I will not try to summarize the whole thing in 20 minutes. That would just be stupid. But instead present some key takeaways from some of its chapter. And in chapter 1, I conceptualize how the book streaming economy works by presenting a model of these platforms and their relations to the publishing business in general. Lots of things, of course, can be said about book streaming services. Here I focus, in this presentation, I will only focus upon one thing, which I call the reading data feedback loop. So the streaming services, they provide a platform which consists of a large selection of titles. And this platform, then, the reader can access through a device, most often a smartphone. This you already know. And to get the access here, the reader pay a subscription fee to the book streaming service company. But also, the reader pays more implicitly with all this data that the streaming service collect, right? And this data contains information that the streaming service can use to fine-tune recommendations and other features on the platform, but it can also be provided or even sold to publishers and authors, etc. So through all this data, remember my former slide here, the streaming services know much more about readers and what people do with books than anyone else in the publishing business do or has ever known before. So the streaming economy and the reading data feedback loop represents a power shift, I'd say, towards the distributors in the world of books. And this will have implications in the future. So in the platform economy, the distributors are the kings. In chapter 2, I discussed the importance of genre for what people choose to read in the audiobook format. And you heard Michelle talk a little bit about this in the former presentation. And in Sweden, audiobook streaming is heavily biased towards popular genre fiction, especially crime fiction and romance. I think we in the Nordics are the one that likes our murders the most. So, I mean, at least for in the Nordic context, you could almost say that the audiobook medium is a medium for genre fiction, more or less. And this is interesting because it's visible not only in the number of streams, but also in the willingness among readers to read a book all the way through, to complete it to the bitter end, right? And one such metric, which is interesting, and which is also used by Storytel and other platforms, is what's called AFD, or the average finishing degree. So the average finishing degree, that's a mean value of how far all users have come in a book when they quit reading. So if the average finishing degree would be 1, that would mean that all users that had started to listen to this book also completed it. And what you get from these figures here is that crime fiction has the by far highest AFD. This kind of makes sense. I mean, it's a part of the narrative construction in crime fiction. You want to know who did it, right? And therefore, you want to keep on reading. And on the other end, then we have prestige fiction, literary fiction, prize-winning fiction, which is the kinds of books that are completed to the lowest degrees in the readers. So one could say that there is a double genre fiction bias in the audio formats. Prestige fiction here, they generate less streams, but also less completion, which with the streaming model also equals less money, since these platforms use a pay-per-minute model. And of course, you are publishers here, publishers who see those figures, it's really likely that they will, make publishing decisions based on those figures in the future, right? These books almost get, you only get half of the money from them. Perhaps we should try to publish something else. Again, so with more data points available, more data points will be used when deciding what to be published. In Chapter 5, I make use of the temporal data to trace when people read audiobooks during the 24 hours of the day, and what we can learn from this. So on an aggregated level, it's really clear that audiobook consumption is more evenly distributed over the hours of the day than ebook consumption. So I should have said this, but in the book streaming service in the Nordics, it's also possible to stream ebooks. But that's a really tiny share of what people are doing. It's less than 10%, I'd say. But for us, this makes a good point of comparison here. Unfortunately, of course, we don't have any data points on how people or when people read print books. But you could think of ebooks as kind of a proxy for when people are reading print books as well. So these graphs show the average consumption per hour for all the users in the data set. And as you can see then, audiobooks are consumed during all hours of the day, while ebooks show a distinct peak in the evening. So you can think of it more or less as traditional reading time in the leisure. This is when you have time to sit down with a book. And this makes sense. It ties into all the frequently highlighted unique selling points for audiobooks that you can read while you are doing something else, right? Working out, driving, cleaning, etc. But what I'd like to stress, what I think is important, is that this aggregate does not show a typical audiobook listener. So rather, the average here accommodates a range of different and quite distinct types of listening patterns. And I have schematically divided them into 3 groups regarding their temporal practices. So first we have the day readers. And these are the people who listen to audiobooks a lot during the working hours of the day. So the 3 lines here, they represent different grades of user bias toward day reading. So the dotted green line is the very biased day readers, and the blue line is readers or listeners that are somewhat biased towards reading in the day. And the day readers, they are a large and important share of audiobook readers. And they seem to use the specificities of the audiobook media to be able to read, again, while doing something else. But there are also other, but still important and significant segments of, for instance, night readers, who read primarily from midnight up until 6 a.m. In the morning. So several of the users in this group, they seem to use, we do not know exactly what they do because we have not talked to them, but they seem to use the audiobook medium in relation to trying to sleep or for treating insomnia in some way. And as you can see, these groups of readers have really, really low rates of listening during the hours of the working day, which is interesting. There can also be night workers in this segment, right? And then finally, we have the evening readers who read primarily between 8 and 11 p.m., something like that. And this is a group that then most closely resemble the ebook readers, and perhaps then print book readers. So this seems to be a traditional reading behavior transferred to the audiobook medium. And the main takeaway from this, I think, is that we should avoid treating audiobook readers or audiobook listeners as one coherent group. Rather, most users appears to have distinct temporal routines tied to their audiobook streaming. So they use the medium in various ways in their everyday life. So some of these practices resemble how they read print books and ebooks, and some showing more media-specific practices. And this, in turn, indicates that there are 2 main groups of audiobook readers. those who were eager readers in print or in ebooks then already before they started to stream audiobooks, and those who were not, sort of the new ones. And this fact is also important to keep in mind. Audiobook streaming in the Nordics, it has gone up much, much more than print book reading has gone down. So it has created a growing market in total. And these various practices of audiobook reading or audiobook listening leads me to the last point I want to make today. And something that I, in the last empirical chapter of my book, label as expanded reading. And by this I mean audiobook reading practices showing in the data that are new, medium-specific, and at times even hard to imagine to transfer to other book formats than streamed audiobooks. This graph visualizes all the users in the data set I have been looking at by 2 parameters. So the number of titles, the number of unique books each user have read during the year studied. So you see, it ranges from 0 books, or 1 book is the lowest, of course, and then up to 125 or something like that. And then the x-axis shows the number of hours spent on the Storytel platform during this year. So each blue dot here represents 1 unique user. And then you see the dashed red line here. That's the result of a linear regression analysis. And this means that there's a really strong and statistical significant correlation between those 2 parameters, which makes perfect sense, right? Of course, the more books you read, the more hours you spend on the platform. Any other result would be really, really strange. But what also comes out of this graph, and which is really intriguing to me, is that the scatter plot is really scattered. I mean, there are lots of blue dots quite far away from this red regression line. And these, I mean, you could look at them as outliers, but these outliers are taken together, not that few, and they are really interesting. So in the last part of my talk, I will zoom in on 3 groups of readers, which I call them the swappers, the repeaters, and the constant readers. And I find these to be of particular interest. So let's start with the ones in the lower right, the repeaters. So these are the users who spend a lot of time on the platform, but on rather or very few books. So this means that they seem to listen to the same books over and over again. And to concretize this a bit, I will show you just one example reader from this segment of repeaters. We can call this reader A. This is a reader, one single user then, that reads more or less every night, and almost all in nights and evening. So the pattern is clear that the user starts at around 22, 23 in the evening, and then continues for, a long time, often 3 times or more. And you can also see in the data that there are lots of sessions that are exactly 180 minutes, which indicates either a sleep timer or that when there has been no user interaction at all with the platform for 3 hours, then it stops. So what's happened here is that this seems to be a reader that reads for sleeping, right? Or listens to audiobooks for sleeping. But what's interesting is that this particular user more or less only reads book in the Little Beach Street Bakery series by Jenny Kogan. So this single title, The Little Beach Street Bakery, makes up around 95% of this consumption. So there's a lot of streaming hours ticking into the system for only this book. So reader A then seems to use this particular book as a sleeping pill that's taken every night during the year studied. which is an interesting practice that's hard to transfer to any other book media. Then let's move on to the swappers, found in the upper left corner. So they stream a lot of books, but they tend to finish rather few of them. So these are the impatient readers in the digital economy. They want to spend time only on books that seems to be worthwhile listening to, right? So they try out a lot of books for a very short time, and then finally they settle for one book. Here's one example. Reader B then reads approximately 1 hour every day in mixed genres, seems to have no really clear preferences, but what stands out is this pattern of trying out a lot of books and then reading and then trying out. So it spends 5 minutes on this book, thrillers, 5 minutes on this, 10 minutes on this, 5 minutes on this, and then finally settles with one of these books. And then sort of this swapping behavior starts all over again. And an important takeaway from this is that the attention span for the audiobook listeners can be rather short here with this subscription model. A book often gets around 5 minutes of listening before the reader decides, no, this was not the title for me, I will move on to the next one. And then, finally, we have the constant readers. These are the binge readers of streamed audiobooks. They are outliers only in the terms of how much and how frequent they listen to audiobooks. I mean, they seem to have audiobooks going on all the time in their life. Not all the time, but I mean a lot. So one example, reader C reads a lot, more or less every day, during both days and nights, mostly crime fiction. The pattern is that when a book is finished, then this reader moves instantly, starts to the next one. So there's sort of no window of not reading in between. It's more or less just keep moving on, listening to books. Also interesting with this particular reader is that they repeat entire series also several times during 1 year. So for instance, they read this pile of books by Swedish thriller duo Lars Kepler 4 times during 1 year. But also, I mean, a similar thing with Camilla Läckberg's thriller, for instance. So the pattern is just that to constantly have a book going on, it doesn't seem to matter that much what they are listening to, just that it's crime fiction. And also this kind of behavior is really hard to imagine for print books. I mean, who would read the same 10 crime novels 4 times through during the same year? This seems to be someone that uses, again, as Michelle told us, perhaps audiobooks for relaxation or for some kind of life soundtrack or music in their everyday life. Not sure. And I mean, how cognitively aware they are of what's actually sort of happening in these narratives, we do not know. So, to conclude then, streamed audiobooks, they create new reading practices, and the subscription-based business models also creates new reading practices. And these two things are really closely tied together. That really shows in the Nordic countries. It's important to see that there are rather distinct types of audiobook readers. And it's also really important, at least for me as a scholar, to pose the question if these streaming patterns really can be considered a form of reading. I mean, some of them are, I mean, to say the least, very, very passive kind of reading. And for you in the publishing business, all of this user data that gets generated all the time, plus this payment per stream minutes model, this will, I think, inevitably lead to a more data-driven publishing, where publishing decisions both on the level of which books that should be published, but also on the textual level. If you can see, okay, so 10% of all the listeners jumped out of the narrative at that particular point. What went wrong? Perhaps we should fix that to the next book. This is something that I think we will see much, much more of in the publishing business to come. Thanks.
Si hay alguna pregunta para Karl, os van a acercar un micrófono Y lo mismo, si alguien prefiere hacerla en español, se le traduce al ponente.
Hi, Karl. Thanks very much for that presentation. There was a lot of very interesting data. I just want to go back to one thing you said at the beginning. You said that in 2022, in Sweden, there had been 45 million audiobooks streamed. What percentage of that is Swedish and what percentage is English? And is there a percentage even for Spanish or other languages? Probably all bunched together.
Close to everything. Not close to everything, but I mean, the vast majority is Swedish titles, and then there are some English titles and no other languages, more or less. So I'd say perhaps 95% Swedish. Something.
Oh, all right. Okay, thanks very much.
Al fondo.
Thank you, Karl, for the presentation. I'm curious to know, why are you calling them readers instead of listeners of audiobooks? It's a pattern that has been established in the market to call it readers instead of listeners.
Yeah, that's a good question. And as you might have noticed, I also switch between those two terms. I mean, for some scholars, it's really important to say that listening to an audiobook is a form of reading. You can think of sort of, for instance, people who are visually impaired or something like that. So that's one reason, but it's also, at least in an academic and also Swedish context, it has been called that. So I'm taking a very sociological approach here. So these are books. Audiobooks are called books. That's also something you could question, right? Yeah, is this really books? But by the industry, they are called books. And when you sort of consume a book, then you are reading a book. This is something that go into the reading statistics, etc. in Sweden. They have so there are lots of things about it. Me personally, I don't really. I mean, I'm really pragmatic about it. So therefore, I tend to switch between those things. But in the book, I have a sort of a lengthy passage where I explained why I have the title "Reading Audio Readers" and not "Reading Audio Listeners," for instance. But to me, it's I think it's interesting because it can be considered a form of reading, but as this data show, it also really is something else, right? And I think it's something in this that's interesting.
Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más.
Thank you, Karl. Very interesting. I was wondering whether you've been able to compare this pattern of consumption with the pattern of consumption of other content, such as music, for instance.
No, but that would be extremely interesting to do, and especially concerning podcasts, for instance, because, I mean, as I see it, there's really not a clear ontological divide between a narrative podcast and some kinds of non-fiction audiobooks, right? It's mostly a matter of from where they emanate, if they come from the book world or if they come from the radio world. And as we have seen the move from Spotify going into first podcasts and now audiobooks, and then we have seen the move from Storytel also starting to launch podcasts of their own. It's really hard to say, I mean, where the difference lies. But I have not been able to do any such comparisons. But that would be interesting work for the future, for sure.
Pues